Well, good evening, everybody. Welcome to Colorado Mesa University, the Asteria Theater, and welcome to our latest Civic Forum event. We are so thrilled to get to welcome a couple of our friends and former governors, Bill Ritter and Bill Owens. He helped me make them a warm welcome. Tonight we have a special opportunity for really a conversation, and we're going to start that conversation really ranging subjects and experiences, but you also get an opportunity to help contribute to this conversation. coloradomesa.edu/ask. Let me say it again, coloradomesa.edu/ask, and you can submit questions for the governors tonight, as I've got a handy electronic device up here that'll help pipe them right in here. So, governors, help us orient a little bit. Retirement from public office looks good on you both. Tell us a little bit about what you've been up to since leaving office. Governor Ritter, do you want to start us off?
Sure, I'd be happy to. So when I left office, I founded a center at Colorado State University. It's a think tank on energy and energy policy. And for the last now almost 14 years, I've run this center. We have a legislator academy. We bring legislators in from around the country, and it's decidedly bipartisan. We have Democrats and Republicans that attend, and we try and work with a group called the Conservative Energy Network so that we're balanced in terms of how we treat the subject matter. We also work with Western governors and actually governors around the country to do a variety of things. So the EPA has passed a new set of coal rules. So we have all of the governors in the West who are coming to us. We bring in the EPA, and you can imagine there's a wide range of views among the governors about those EPA rules, but it's really a constructive conversation about what the governors think is wrong with them, what other governors may think is right with them. And so that's a mix of things we do, and I also do a lot of facilitating of conversations. I just facilitated a conversation among stakeholders in Colorado on the siting of renewables, wind and solar in rural Colorado. So just that kind of stuff. I've been doing that for 14 years now.
Governor Owens?
My background recently has been much more boring than Bill's. I've been in the private sector. I am on the board of a number of public companies. I am a director with a law firm. I spent a lot of time overseas. I was in Ukraine in November. That's not easy to get to Ukraine. You have to do it by train. Was back in Germany at the invitation of the Ukrainian government in June for the European Ukrainian Economic Development Conference. I am very pro-Ukraine in that horrible war. And so in the years since I've been in office, I've been trying to make up for the lost income that being a state legislator and then treasurer and then governor gives you. And it's an honor to have been served, but nobody does it for income. And so I've just been focused on the private sector since I was governor.
You both have this really unique experience, and it really is a short list of people who've had the honor of serving as governor of Colorado. And I wonder if you might share with our audience, you've traveled this state back and forth, up and down in every wide spot in the road and small town. Some of your favorite memories or places in Colorado that you got to experience as governor?
That's such a difficult question, and I always made a point of never saying I had a favorite ski area, or, I have a law degree from CU, an undergraduate degree from CSU. I never said which team I favored. It's just like one of those things that's just kind of dangerous to do, but it is an absolutely beautiful place to govern. I mean, it's just this remarkable place. And so, I don't know how many people have ever been to Silverton, Colorado. Well, my father bossed a job in Silverton, Colorado. He put in the first water and sewer services, and to go back there as governor, I went there as a kid with him on a semi-trailer truck over Red Mountain Pass, to go back into Silverton as a governor and think about being in one of the most beautiful places in the world, but in a very different circumstance. And I'll just say finally, John, my favorite memory about being governor, my mother was the mother of 12 kids. And my father did wind up leaving our family. I can remember coming down in the mansion, there's this big bay window, and there's my mother, a native Coloradoan, raised pretty poor, staring out the bay window of the governor's mansion. That's my favorite memory of being governor.
It's
Bill
beautiful.
is, that's interesting because I'm going to tell a mother story in the mansion too. I'm one of 5, born and raised in Fort Worth, very middle class, didn't have quite the challenges, and Bill and I have been friends for many years, didn't have quite the challenges that Bill did. But Dad passed away and Mom moved up to Colorado when I was governor, and just loved being up here where her son was the governor. One time we're having a dinner at the mansion, and it's an economic development dinner, and it's been underwritten by some company that is helping us afford the dinner, and we had some very expensive wine. Now, Mom liked her red wine, and at the end of the evening, Mom's corking half the bottle of Silver Oak because she's going to take it home and drink it for the next week or two. And I said, Mom, you can't take the wine home. It's in essence state property. But, this is, your mom's looking out the window. My mom's trying to steal the wine. But Bill and I were talking on our way over. We flew over today. And as we were flying over, I was telling him a story from when you'd finish a long day as governor. We have a little King Air 200 that the state has, and you'd be in it and all day long. It'd be pretty tiring at the end of the day, and we'd be coming back towards Denver, and often you'd be coming across the mountains, and this literally happened. I had left Grand Junction, and we're going over Vail and all of that, and I turned to somebody on the plane, and I said, can you imagine how boring it would be to be the governor of Kansas? You've just got this little square, nothing, Topeka and Wichita. Ooh, look, there's Topeka. But, here it's just so beautiful. And, we're all privileged to get to live in Colorado. And it was an honor that Bill and I got to be your governors for a period of years.
So let's talk about that for a minute. You both got a lot done. And I wonder, as you look back on your time in office as governor, what are some of the things that you look back on and say, man, I'm really glad we got that accomplished? And maybe on the flip side of that coin, what are some of those issues that you felt like I wish I would have made a little more progress on? Governor Owens?
It's somebody asked me that tonight at the reception, and there are some particular things that I'm proud of, but generally it was 8 good years of honest government, and we really did, and Bill followed that with 4 years of honest government. In our 12 years, there weren't any scandals regarding ethics or corruption or any of the things that we certainly hear about from other states. We just really tried to give good governance to the people. And if you then drill down, it would be really proud of what we did for charter schools, what we did for transportation, and what we did for tax reduction. Bill?
Yeah, it's really interesting, John, that question. And we have spoken at different forums together before, and people will say that and say, one of the things you need to know is you are really building on what somebody else has done before. We were really very interested in trying to do a variety of things around healthcare. And this community, Grand Junction and Mesa County, it was one of the best communities in America in terms of just keeping costs down and the quality of treatment high. But he formed a commission when he was governor. I took that commission and added a couple of people to it. They made recommendations, and we passed Senate Bill 208 that was a lot about trying to understand how to keep costs in control, have a provider fee pass. It's one thing, but it's so funny because I don't feel like I did that on my own at all. I think that we built upon that. K through 12 education, there are a variety of things, that we were doing at the same time. And that, again, we inherited some parts of that from Governor Owens. He and I don't agree politically on every single thing, but it's so funny that the mix of things that you wind up doing, rarely are they things that you did and that you can claim credit for without acknowledging that you're building on somebody else's foundation.
As you think, both of you had very long careers of public service, and it strikes me, you and your family served as missionaries, you were a district attorney. Governor, you served at many roles in the state legislature, the House, the Senate, you served as state treasurer, that are not always real glorious roles that require a lot of sacrifice. And I wonder, some of the questions that have already come in from some young people asking what advice you might have as you think back on some of that service, and what advice you have maybe for some of our college students who are thinking about a life of service, whether it's public office or otherwise.
Yeah, I'm really concerned that the current political system, or politics generally, is actually causing people to turn away from it. Because I got to tell you, service is a fairly rewarding thing. And, like Governor Owens said, there can be a financial sacrifice to that in doing that. But at the end of the day, I'm now 68 years old, I feel really good about the things that I've done in my life that were about service. And it was meaningful. It's been a great thing for my family in so many respects. And my, family has, I think, probably inherited some of those things that make you a good servant, a good public servant. It's a fantastic sort of career, and I'm afraid, because I have 4 kids, 38 down to 31, and I'm afraid my kids think less about service because of what they're witnessing in the political culture.
I agree. It was Edmund Burke that said, all that is necessary for the triumph of evil is that good people do nothing. And as politics, and I like to think public service, gets more and more divisive, it's keeping the good people out of public service. And then that becomes a feedback loop that leads to less good public servants, and also democracy itself becomes at risk. And, this country is worth fighting for. And it doesn't mean that every one of my Democratic friends is wrong. I'm a conservative Ronald Reagan Republican. But I really understand the need that in a democracy, as opposed to totalitarian systems, which I've studied a lot, especially Russia, there's 2 ways basically governments operate. One is who has the most guns and the most power gets to make the rules. That's the system I don't like. The other system is let's have discussion, debate, argument, and at the end of the day we raise our hands and say, okay, all those in favor, and then the majority rules. And we need to, that is such a better system than what I've seen all over the world, and I've been in more than 100 countries. This is a really good system, but it needs good people to be part of it, good people who can argue and still be friends and still be ladies and gentlemen about it. And Bill and I, we can probably give you 8 issues you could ask us about where we are on really different sides. But in doing this a few times, I know that we could argue about it and disagree about it and still walk out of here, as we will, and have a Coors beer on the plane going back tonight.
You know, the thing that concerns me is that this thing about totalitarian rule seems to be taking hold in places and replacing healthy democratic institutions in Hungary, in Poland, in, you know, even I think the Netherlands, but in South America, in Mexico. You know, there were things that happened in Mexico that were about populist government, that was more about totalitarian rule. And what's really interesting is, without healthy democratic institutions, you can't actually solve big problems. You don't really get to disagree about them, in a sense, and you can't solve big problems without having both sides of the aisle chime in.
You bet. And these totalitarian systems that are taking over are from the left and the right.
Yeah.
Hungary and some of those countries are considered right, but Brazil, Venezuela, I mean, you can run through the left-wing governments that are totalitarian, and what is missing in all of them are the institutions and the trust. And, you know, both Bill and I are concerned a little bit about some of that starting to happen here from both sides. And we're not, you know, it's just democracy is just so important. It's still an experiment. It really hadn't been in existence, but for a little bit more than 200 years. And so it's still an experiment, and we just got to fight for it. It really is essential.
I had a student in my office the other day who had raised an interesting observation about this question around democracy, and I'd love to hear your perspectives. And this idea that in a place like Colorado, which is kind of an interesting microcosm of some of the challenges between urban and rural interests, where the majority vote might have a disproportionate and potentially undesired impact in some rural areas. And I would love to hear your perspectives. You both face some of these challenges around whether it's water or wolves or natural resources, transportation funding and the like. There's a lot of those kind of issues, and I'd love to hear a little bit about how you thought about that as governor, and maybe how you think about that now in terms of balancing those competing interests.
Okay, I'll go first on that. I think it helped. I was off of a farm and raised on a farm, and so that was probably helpful in being able to go into rural Colorado and have conversations with people in rural Colorado. The most important thing to me was to show up. Because I think, you know, we talk a little bit about flyover states that don't get any attention from, you know, the Democratic Party. There are people in the Midwest who feel like they're in a flyover state. There are people in rural Colorado that feel very left behind by the conversation happening in Denver, and even by the conversation happening in Washington, D.C. And I know this in part because part of my family is still in rural Colorado. And their friends, their family, their communities feel like they are not part of a bigger conversation. So for a governor to show up and to sit down and have conversations and to understand kind of how that community organizes its values for the community is really the most important part of being governor in a state that is not heterogeneous.
I agree. Bill mentioned being raised on a farm. In fact, when I moved to Colorado in '77, moved to Aurora, Colorado, which was the same town where his farm was. And I'm from Fort Worth, Texas, from outside of Fort Worth, Texas. Wasn't raised on a farm, but when I was 8 years old, Dad, who sold life insurance for the Pat Owens agency, got invited to New York City for an insurance convention, and while he's there, he walks down the street to the NBC studios where they're taping The Price is Right, the TV show. He walks in and watches the taping, and then they pass around questionnaires. Would you like to be on The Price is Right show the next day? And he fills out a questionnaire. They interview him. The next day, he's on The Price is Right. I'm 7 or 8 years old. So they had a mink stole. He had no idea what a mink stole was worth. He had all this, but they had a Shetland pony. And Dad, we were from outside of Fort Worth, and he knew exactly what a Shetland pony was worth. So he won the Shetland pony. Mom was really angry he didn't take the $200 because she had 5 kids and she still didn't have a mink stole. Never
Or
had
the mink
one.
stole, that's right.
But anyway, he brought the Shetland pony home. We put it out on a ranch, and I grew up. We ended up getting a quarter horse, so I have a little bit of rural background with my Shetland pony, though I hate Shetland ponies. Everybody in my family rode, and I was a good rider, and Bill's ridden a lot too. You don't want to ride on a Shetland pony, but they're mean. What Bill said is true. You do have to show up, and you just have to. This is what's important about having the right sort of people who are in office. We may have understood that Saguache didn't have very many people, but it still needed a voice, and they deserved a voice. And, I had precincts in Aurora that had more people than Lyman, but you still are governor of all the people. And I think it's just something that when you put your hand on that Bible and swear that you're going to be the governor of all the people, you just have to do it. And we both made decisions that were very unpopular with large constituencies, but you just do the right thing. And surprisingly, more people in government do that than are sometimes being given credit for.
I think today, when you showed us the Tilly Bishop reflection room, I knew Tilly Bishop when I was the DA of Denver because he was very involved in the legislature and in criminal justice kinds of issues, and especially on the juvenile diversion side. But I think about that. So he's from Grand Junction, but he had an outsized voice in the Capitol. So did Russell George. Right. Russell George was in both of our cabinets, Rifle, Colorado. My favorite thing about Russell George is he didn't tell you that he went to Harvard Law School in the first 20 minutes you knew him. But that's a joke for maybe there. Anyway, so Russell George had an outsized voice. These are people coming from really small, populated areas, but they controlled a lot inside the Capitol because of their personality and just their devotion to service. So, yes, rural Colorado can be outvoted. 80-some% of people live within 30 miles of I-25 in Colorado, so that's a big disproportionate number, and that can have a negative influence on things happening in rural Colorado, but when they send legislators there, they can be very, very capable and make a lot of changes that are good for rural Colorado.
Bill, just like Jim Robb, some of you may remember Jim Robb, state representative from Grand Junction, named a state park after him, just the penultimate public servant. When I was elected in '82, the speaker puts an adult near you and assigned Jim Robb to sit next to me to make sure that the young Bill Owens didn't do anything stupid. He failed a few times, but he was generally successful. But Jim was so prominent in the Capitol, and nobody cared that he was from Grand Junction. It was just, and so it's important, it's doubly important that rural areas, and Grand Junction isn't rural, I know that, but that the less populated, the West Slope, send particularly effective legislators to Denver. Because if you do, they can be very effective as there's such a great history and that we can talk about here. Then there's Tim Foster. Tim was in my cabinet, was the majority leader of the House when I was in the House, and is just a phenomenal public servant.
Yes.
I hope Tim's here. I don't know if he's here or not.
Sandpaper isn't going to lower himself with being with 2 governors. Tim's one of my best friends, and I'm still in close touch with him.
You mentioned Russell George, who wanted to be here, but Russ, of course, is a rifle Republican, served as Speaker of the House, and then served in cabinet posts for both of you. And it seems like maybe that's a good intro to this conversation around bipartisanship, which feels pretty non-existent in some ways today. And I wonder how you thought about it both as governor and maybe your reflections now today, with hindsight as 2020.
Well, I actually wrote a book in 2015 about energy policy. It's called Powering Forward. It's an energy policy book, so the last royalty I got from my publisher, I owed them money. Somebody brought back a bunch of books, and so it's not all that popular. But I say in the book, I never thought the work product was as good when it was only informed by one side. I just really believe that this listening across, and I don't want to make it sound like candy and flowers, right? There are rough and tumble conversations when you're governor with your party, with the other party. There's some really knockdown, drag out kinds of things, but it's just so much better when it comes from both sides of the aisle and somebody saying, well, think about this, think about it differently. And I think at the end of the day, from a policy perspective, their framework is just much superior to sort of one party thing. And so what I worry about is that the political system is sort of delivering, people that think about that not like I do, that they don't think that it's important to talk across the aisle, or if they do talk across the aisle, it's vitriol, it's not constructive, and part of that's how we campaign, but the other part of it is just kind of where we seem to find ourselves in the political system, and I don't think we're going to offer up the best policy choices for Colorado or for the nation unless we can get back to that.
I went to Stephen F. Austin State University in Nacogdoches, Texas, for undergraduate, and like Bill was putting myself through school. I had 3 sisters, and in those, Mom and Dad couldn't afford to put 5 of us through, and so told the 2 boys, you guys get through on your own because we're going to have to help the girls a little bit more. And so I was putting myself through, and then I decided I'm going to go to law school, and that meant 3 more years of tuition, and a friend came to me and said, well, they've started this new graduate school at Texas called the OBJ School of Public Affairs, and essentially they need a nominal Republican student. I was a Republican at the time, and basically I was an affirmative action. This is really true. They gave me a scholarship to go to the University of Texas LBJ School, and I literally, out of 50 students, it was only in its 3rd year, was the only Republican. We had some Marxists, we had some anarchists, we had some socialist labor, we had some Democrats, and then there was me. And what that taught me was I realized I'm going to have to learn to get along with people even if we don't agree on policy. And it probably was why I got elected governor, because it was the closest race in Colorado history, and I got some Democratic votes just because they liked me more than perhaps my friend in the other party. But we need to have that ability to talk across the aisle, even if we don't end up voting with them. I mean, it is just so essential. And I mean, I was walking into graduate school, and there'd be 20 students plus the professors. Weren't a whole lot of Republican professors on the faculty of the LBJ School of Public Affairs while Lyndon Johnson was still alive, which he was. And so they'd all turn to me and say, well, Owens, what's the response? And I'm thinking, shit, it's 23-1. This isn't fair. Shoot. Go ahead, John. Excuse me for that.
This is America, and you're an adult. You're allowed to. A related question is you both had successful policy agendas, which of course requires working closely with the legislature. The way that that's happening today, I think one of the questions came through that indicates that maybe it's not quite as it was. And I just wonder if you would both comment on some of the successful approaches you had, what allowed you to be successful on the second floor, as they say in the Capitol, with your legislative counterparts, and how you navigated both parties, but also the sort of divided government and the balance of different branches there.
I'll start with this one, and I had the privilege of serving with a Republican legislature. I had the privilege of serving with a Republican and Democratic, where one party controlled one house and one party controlled the other. And then I had the privilege of serving with a Democratic legislature. And it was, it just required, when I had a Republican legislature, it meant often I was disagreeing with even my friends in my party, because I had a different role as governor, and I know Bill felt this as well. You have a different role when you're governor. You're just not a party hack, not that our legislators are, but you just have a higher calling, and that sounds arrogant, but it's not. You're the only person representing the entire state. And so it was essential to work across party lines during that process. And I'm going to turn it over to Bill in a second, but I do think that today we don't teach enough in K through 12 responsible citizenship, civics. We just don't do it. And that's going to be deadly in a democracy, because then you turn on Hollywood movies, you see the scandals that actually happen, but you don't have that grounding and fundamental understanding of the importance of living in a democracy, because we're not teaching it. And this isn't a cheap complaint by some old guy. I really know that the curriculum in most of our school districts isn't teaching what it is to be an American, how you have to accept the responsibility to be a citizen in a democracy, and that it goes both ways. We have expectations of government, but in exchange, we should be inputting into that civic process as well. Bill?
So I don't know if you remember the conversation, but after I was elected, I sat down, we had a transition protocol where he and I met and our teams met, but he knew that I was going to serve with the Democratic legislature, and he said, this is going to be tough on you to have majorities of your party in both legislatures, because they tend to think that you'll think like them all the time, and you got to be the governor for Colorado. And the first bill I vetoed was a labor bill that they had introduced it the day before I was inaugurated in committee, and a month later I vetoed it, and all hell broke loose with my own party. But it was kind of like, okay, I have to do this because for the good of the order across the state, this matters a lot, and you have to be willing to do that. And the other thing you have to do is, in order to be, I think, effective, is to reach out to the other party, even if they're not in the majority. And we had sponsors who were Republican sponsors of some fairly big pieces of legislation, and we thought that was the right thing to do. And Rob Whitwer was a sponsor of a really big piece of legislation our first year. Frank McNulty, believe it or not, was a sponsor of a piece of legislation I had in year 3. And Frank McNulty did not particularly like me, but the fact that he was believing that this was the right thing to do, and we could get him to be a sponsor along with other Democrats, was certainly a helpful thing in showing bipartisanship and showing that we were really caring about the entire state and not just the people who voted for me.
So we've got a few questions along similar lines. So I'm going to try and amalgamate this a little bit, but the divisiveness and inflammatory speech and challenging rhetoric that seems like it's simply about winning the next election. And the question is something like this: are there tangible, specific things in your estimation that we could do, changes we could make to our system that would provide less of that, that would provide more statesman-like leadership that one might reflect the two of you have embodied better than some of our current leaders?
Well, I'm not a big fan of campaign finance limits. I'm a fan of total transparency. So if somebody wants to give, in Colorado we have Amendment 27, so serious limits, $1,000 when I ran for governor, as you know, and you know, you can cap that, but then there's the dark side, the other money that comes in and flows in through the back door, and it's not transparent, and you don't really know, okay, who owns this, you know, whose money is this that's fueling these advertisements, those kinds of things. It's a hard thing to change the political culture because of where we've gotten to in a variety of ways, and it's going to take people. I think Governor Owens is talking about civics education. College campuses are going to have to think about their role in trying to change the political culture to back out of this, but the sort of incivility in the political dialogue is, you know, maybe mirroring some of the things happening in popular culture. Maybe the reverse is true. Popular culture is mirroring some of the things in the political culture. But at some point, we have to get people back to a notion that there's a social contract between Americans and their government that's really about, you know, the good of the people and about self-interest well understood, as de Tocqueville talked about, that it's about all of us trying to understand where our best interests are and not view the world as you against me. Because I think that's really what happened in the political culture, is people did become more interested in winning than they were interested in serving, and they were more interested in sort of their own best naked self-interest as opposed to a broadly understood self-interest.
One of the things that Bill and I did a number of years ago is support an initiative that allows independents to vote in either party's primary. And it wasn't popular with, but our reason, and I know half of you might disagree with that, and you just chose not to boo me, so thank you. But the reason for it was that within my party, and I am a Reagan Republican, but sometimes we have these primaries that divide us so much that if you have one moderate vote over 200 votes in a legislature, you're going to get defeated in that primary. And the Democratic Party has exactly the same problem. You know, if you're a Democratic state representative in Denver, and congratulations in this last primary, Bill, where two of them got taken out, two extreme leftists, but they had to be, it was an effort. But what happens is that when the body politic, when the electorate doesn't protect the person that occasionally disagrees with them, but instead throws them out because of one vote, then in fact you get these polarized parties where there isn't one Republican that is willing to ever vote for something Governor Ritter might support because he's going to get defeated in the primary. And the same thing happens in the Democratic Party. And so Bill and I, the model was, you know, if you have a really good Republican who's getting savaged because of one vote, he or she can benefit from having moderate independents come in and help them in that primary. And I know that's anathema to somebody like me until about 10 years ago, because I was active in the Republican Party since I've been a teenager. But these primaries were driving us into different silos, and that's why we came together and passed that initiative. What we need is just more understanding within the body politic. We're not going to be perfect all the time, but look at the overall record and understand that occasionally, you know, I don't agree with even my own family all the time, much less the electorate all the time, but Bill?
Well, I've already answered the question. I think I would just say
Oh,
that-
you're getting to speak twice then.
but it's really interesting, and you had a little bit of this, I had a lot of it, which was the Great Recession. There's nothing that tests you in terms of sort of your ability to govern and to think about people than governing in a recession. And so ours was called the Great Recession, but you experienced it as well, and you have to start cutting budgets. And a budget, I always said, was a moral document about what you valued. And it was really interesting to me. Felt to me like we had bipartisan support for those kinds of cuts, that the budget wasn't used as a weapon. And I think it would be today. I think it would be weaponized in a different way today by the minority party, whoever is in the minority, and that's a shame.
Question has come in about some of the current issues that are, I think, maybe front and center. And so I want to maybe just ask you directly, from a purely policy standpoint, what are the one or two or three issues you're most concerned about for Colorado as a public policy matter? And what do you think are some like real direction and policy prescriptions, solutions that we might be able to take on?
You know, my take on that would be, I think we're facing a huge challenge in criminal justice. I think that I've looked at the data, and Bill's a career prosecutor, and he may or may not agree with me on what I'm about to say, and if so, I understand, because he's an expert. He's put people in jail. But I really believe that the lessening of prison sentences, the lessening of sanctions against juvenile criminals, to where gangs simply get some kid that's 15, knowing he can't be tried in adult court except under some circumstances. For a while, we had essentially, it was legal to steal cars as long as they were cheap. It really was in Colorado, so we became number one in the country in car thefts. When you look at what is happening, we've closed about a third of our prison space, and therefore judges and parole boards are under significant pressure to let people go or release them or not put them in the first place. I think criminal justice is, when you look at what is it that we expect from a government, as a conservative, my expectation is public protection. And that is state and local, it's cops and law enforcement, and national, it's national defense. That's what I want my U.S. government to do first and foremost, is to protect the country. And what I want my local government and state government to do is to protect my 5 granddaughters and my family and me, because I'm not always going to be able to do that myself. And I think the state of Colorado is failing in that responsibility right now. And so that's what I would place. We have other challenges. Transportation is huge, and I wouldn't mind more dollars going into roads occasionally. That's just a bias of mine since I use them. But, we could go into other issues. But I really believe that criminal justice and failure to put enough bad people behind bars is a real challenge in Colorado and should be hopefully addressed in the future. Bill?
Yeah, so I think that is a challenge. And I think at the heart of that, there's a lot about drugs and drug policy that was softened over time. But I don't know if that's our biggest challenge. It may be. I think, especially in my professional life, I work a lot on environmental issues and climate change. And I would argue that the way things are happening, and this is probably a place where there's some departure in terms of what we think most about, but I think that's a really significant issue. So I'm not saying crime and justice are not issues. They are things that we have to deal with. Climate change is this really important issue that is not being dealt with at the level that we need to, and we stand a very good chance of, walking away from some international agreements we've made, and I think that's problematic for us as well, because there's a lot of people in this world that are going to feel the impacts of this, and many of them have not been any part of the problem in creating it. If you think about just greenhouse gases and putting greenhouse gases in the air. So I think that's a big thing, and I have spent a long time thinking about it and working on it. The other thing I worry about is what I call the safety net. And these are not unrelated, right? Crime and justice can't be unrelated to what I consider to be some safety net issues. I think a K through 12 education should be part of the American safety net, and I think we're failing to do the job we need to do, and I don't disagree that civics should be taught in school, that people should feel good about being Americans, but there's a variety of circumstances. I don't think outcomes should all depend upon your zip codes, and I think there's too many places in this country, but even in this state, where the outcomes that are going to happen in your life depend very much on where you live, where you're born, what community you're raised in. And so I always kind of think about that question, John, when people say, what are the important issues? That you can't silo crime and justice from education. You can't silo it from, quite frankly, race issues that exist. And, there's just a variety of things. You can't silo it from health outcomes. You can't silo it from environmental circumstances. It's all kind of part of it. And in thinking about that, it's like, how do we make sure that the safety net's there for everybody?
And this is where if Bill and I were running against each other in a race, I'd come back and say, my answer to criminal justice doesn't depend on whether or not we fix climate change. Bill's right. Education does have something to do with crime, and so do some of those other issues. But basically, in my opinion, the state of Colorado, you serve 42% of the sentence you're sentenced to. We've dramatically cut the number of people that are in prison. A lot of people are on the streets who deserve, and richly so, to be in prison, and sorry for taking extra time, but just notice the next time there's a horrible crime and they show the rap sheet of the guy, and it's always a guy in horrible crimes. Hate to admit it, but it really is. Look at his rap sheet, and almost every time he should be in prison right now when he committed the crime. I mean, you just look down, he was in the system. 30 days ago, he was 60 days ago, 90 days ago, and it's really true. And I would love, Bill's the prosecutor, so he has the street cred on this issue. But we do disagree on some things, and it's fun to get to disagree because John's doing such a good job of screening out all the good questions.
There's some fascinating questions coming through. You both developed and possess a great deal of expertise around energy and energy policy. Colorado has long been a leader in this area in a variety of different ways. This will probably be an area that's, especially in rural Colorado, that's really important to a lot of people because whether it's a primary job that somebody's working in or whether it's just frankly the price you pay to the utility companies, I would just love to hear you both dive in just a little bit around where you see Colorado's leadership moving forward and our opportunities around this question of providing the energy we all need for the future.
Sure. So this is my day job. And, I was a facilitator for a conversation that involved major utilities, major environmental NGOs, and environmental justice leaders. And the utilities were all of a mind that they could get to 85% reduction in their emissions by 2035 or 2040. Xcel Energy in Colorado provides power to about 2/3 of Coloradans, and they've got a commitment to get to 85% reduction. They don't know how to get to the last part of that. They don't know how to get from 85 to 100, and they believe that they're going to have to, and part because they're being told that they should, but they also are doing their own threat analysis about climate change. So I think we are a leader because we have a set of policies in place that have caused us to move in that direction of lowering our greenhouse gas emissions. Tri-State, which is an independent power producer for co-ops, has a commitment to reduce its emissions by 85% by 2030 as well, has what's called the Responsible Energy Plan. And, Tri-State wasn't always that way. So I think on the power sector side, we're actually going to get to the place that we need to get to by 2030. And the question is, how do you do the next 15%? Is it natural gas? Is it hydrogen? Is it nuclear? Is it some combination of those things? But we're going to get there. On the transportation side, I think that's a more difficult answer. We have a plan to get 50% reduction in emissions by 2030, but transportation is the biggest emitter now, as opposed to the power sector, which it used to be. And there's, a need to transition out of emitting transportation. This is going to be another place of disagreement, so glad you asked it. But we're going to, my view is we're going to have to do that. The transportation, the building sector, the industrial sector, and even in the agriculture sector, they're all emitting sectors. And for us to do our part, and really in many respects to be a beacon on a hill for other states that are watching what we're doing, we're going to have to think about policies that can act as levers in emissions reduction.
This is another area where two good friends like us can really, really disagree. Obviously, we want emissions to be improved. Obviously, we want to improve our climate. We are nowhere near going to get to 85% in either Xcel or Tri-State by 2030. This is 2024. They're not going to be anywhere near it, and this is causing Xcel right now privately to panic because Xcel made its bed with the state government, and now it's having to sleep in it. And here's how Xcel gets paid. It gets paid on a percentage of its investment in new capital. So when I opened a new Xcel plant during my term, they open it and they're getting paid, is it 8 or 8.5%?
It could be 8.5.
8.5% on that new plant. And as you depreciate it, they don't get paid the 8.5%. First year they depreciated X amount. And so it's always in Xcel's interest to build new plants. So when we had perfectly good natural gas plants and even coal plants that were emitting far less because of modern pollution control, Xcel wants to get rid of those plants because they're depreciated and they're not making that 8 or 8.5% on it. So government comes to Xcel and says, hey, you want to be good citizens, don't you? Reduce your emissions. Are you okay if we make you do this? And Xcel says, hell yeah, because they're getting to build new solar and new wind. And this is something that Bill and I have a respectful disagreement on. I don't think we're going to get anywhere near it. And I would even be prepared to discuss climate change with Bill. We don't have time today. But in terms of whether it's man-caused, human-caused, because I have a lot of geology. I got a minor in geology. I was telling Bill on the way over here. And my reading of geological history is we've had climate change way before we had people. And I'm not sure that in the last 25 years, the climate change we've been seeing is, John, out of respect to you, I'm not going to debate Bill right now on climate change, but I will make a bet. Bill, I'll bet you $5 that Xcel doesn't get anywhere near 85% in the next 5 years. If it did, we'd be broke because we wouldn't be able to afford what they're going to have to be charging us.
It's actually just not true, but I won't bet you the $5. I'll bet you a Coors Banquet beer in 2030.
Yes, sounds good.
You heard it here.
Sounds good.
6 years and a six-pack of beer.
Yes.
We'll figure that out.
Good.
A follow-on around education in K-12. Colorado has some very disparate and different school districts and funding sources for those districts. And I wonder, as you all now have the benefit of hindsight, what are some of the things we can do to continue to build, grow, and support K-12 education in Colorado? Governor Owens, you want to take a stab at that first?
You know, it's this is probably a subject that brings more emotion and controversy than any other, because we all are part of the public education experience. Either our kids go there, or we went there, or friends do. And my 3 children went to public schools a total of 39 years, 12 plus a year of kindergarten. And I went to all of their teacher meetings. I was very involved in their education. And I care about public schools, but I don't see the connection between funding and outcome. In fact, I could show you data that says DPS gets more funding than anybody else in the state and has worse results. And that's not necessarily causal. My belief in K-12 is above a certain amount, you need to have that amount, but then what you need is you need discipline, you need rules, you obviously need engaged parents. And when teachers tell me, well, the parents aren't engaged, I say, okay, but you still have the child for 7 hours a day. What can you do in the 7 hours even if the parents don't provide help at home? I really understand the challenge in today's society of trying to get a 12-year-old to do almost anything. But we've got to bring back to K through 12 some rules, some responsibilities, some discipline. And if parents don't make that happen within their school district, then we're going to get the results we're getting, which is most of our kids who graduate from high school are not graduating with a 12th grade ability in mathematics or reading or writing. And that's a fact. Bill?
Well, it's a fascinating, I think, question. So I started as DA in 1993. It was called the Summer of Violence. I got to know the superintendent of Denver Public Schools, and there were 3 while I was while I was DA. They all said the same thing. A child who enters kindergarten and doesn't have 2,000 words in their vocabulary is going to start behind, and they're going to stay behind. And so part of what we're struggling with is what's the product that's coming into the public schools in the beginning. One of my cabinet members, Rico Munn, became the superintendent of schools in Aurora. There were 134 languages spoken as a first language by Aurora students. That's another challenge that is a pretty difficult challenge. And, I think Rico would say he was underfunded in his ability to sort of compensate for all of those different languages that were spoken. But that's, another set of policies to think about. What we, I think, often do is we wind up in this conversation trying to reduce it to sort of a simple thing about, and I'm not trying to debate Governor Owens, but it's so much more complicated to try and understand how to improve the K through 12 system if you don't try and think about that child's life from the time they're born until they're 5 years old and starting kindergarten or full day childcare, those kinds of things. Thanks. That just matters a lot. And I think we pay too little attention to that child at 4 years old or 3 years old or 2 years old. And again, this is kind of a safety net question. I don't think it would be, a perfect outcome if we paid more attention to 2 and 3 and 4-year-olds, but I think we would improve the ability of kids to not start behind, and that could make the difference. It's a tough issue. My wife is a school teacher, as you probably remember, John, and you know, she's got a lot of friends that are school teachers. They're pretty dedicated. They're all public school teachers, pretty dedicated people, and really care a lot about their kids. And they gave, in many respects, their professional life was about teaching students. And so I think they would even argue this is a really tough nut to solve, but give me a byproduct coming in the door at 5 years old, and we'll turn something different out.
And I really agree with everything Bill just said, but then I would say, okay, so you get the child in pre-K or K or first grade, and you're going to have he or she for 6 years, 8 years, 10 years, 12 years, and if you can't perfect what happens to the child at home, because that's too large even for our school system. But what are we going to do for the 7 hours we have the child? And if even that child goes home to a really tough existence at home, we've still got them for 7 hours. And if we want to have that child have any hope for the future, at least for the 7 hours we have that child for maybe 8 years, let's teach them how to read and do basic math so that they can get a job. And yet, if we always say, and this wasn't what Bill was saying, but if we always say, well, the child was arrived fully formed at age 5, then what are we doing with all these years in the meantime? And so I know I'm sounding naive, but I'm trying to control what we control, and what we control up to a point is the 7 hours. And so in the classroom, we ought to have the discipline so that that child in those 7 hours isn't in a chaotic situation. And I know, again, there's some teachers here who will say, come to my classroom, and I agree with you. You're doing the Lord's work. But I also believe the current system, we've been putting more and more into it, and we're not getting results out of it. And even if that 5-year-old is flawed to start with as a learnable child, we still have to do better than we're doing now. And I know Bill agrees with that as well.
This ballot that we're all about to, maybe you already have started arriving, is going to be one of the longer ballots that we've all received in Colorado. You all have seen and frankly participated in and helped lead a whole variety of those kind of things. I wonder if you might share for the audience your view of how Colorado has used the ballot to sort of try and solve problems, and where you think it's maybe headed in the wrong direction, where you've like where it's heading, and just generally your view on this very Colorado direct democracy approach.
Yeah, there are things that I think are positive about it, things that we've done in the ballot that I would agree with, but I'm going to take on another sacred cow, and that's Tabor. We passed Tabor in 1992. Prior to 1992 in the state legislature, every couple of years they'd look at the fuel tax, the highway users tax, and they would change it to fund transportation. And it was like 22 cents a gallon was the fuel tax, the state fuel tax in 1992, and today it's still 22 cents a gallon. So we deprived the legislature of the ability to do something that I think was very rational, which was figure out how to pay for roads, how to pay. We actually passed legislation called FASTER, and FASTER, was a fee, not a tax, and the Supreme Court upheld that it was a fee, not a tax, but that put new money into transportation. Governor Owens had his own method of putting money into transportation, but I felt like we deprived our legislators of doing something that was their responsibility when we passed Tabor, and so that kind of a thing, it's only up or down. You don't have nuance, and you'll see this in some of the ballot measures this year. There's not nuance for legislators to debate something out and get to perhaps a different result than yes or no. The things that we're doing, the stuff on sentencing is a good example. You and I could have an honest disagreement about that and get to a good place, but to say yes to 85% or no to 85% is not really fair to people. It doesn't feel fair to me in Colorado that we have these sort of limited choices. The other thing I'm going to just comment on really quickly, we've got a ballot measure that says no trophy hunting for wildcats, lynx, and bobcats. And first of all, lynx is protected. Secondly, we have 122 scientists in the Department of Parks and Wildlife that get paid to do a job to manage populations, wildlife populations. It's like, why are we voting on that yes or no? That's just such a wrong way in my mind to manage public policy when you have a whole group of scientists who do this as subject matter experts.
Bill and I just signed a letter opposing that initiative together. Yeah. And we won't, President Marshall, take your time tonight to debate the Taxpayer Bill of Rights, Tabor, except I would place myself on the other side of Bill's comments on that issue. Strongly in favor of it because it basically says government's going to live within a budget, and if it goes outside of that budget, they have to get our permission, and otherwise they send us the money, the excess, and this year it's going to be about $1.7 billion. I think I saw in a headline, but initiatives are generally there as a safety valve when government doesn't do the job that the citizens want. And sometimes initiatives are used for special interests, like whoever it is that's trying to, ban trophy hunting. Who can be, I understand the emotional impact of that, but it doesn't make much sense because of the fact that we use hunting to manage that population for the good of the population. And I will say the legislature passed a huge transportation tax increase 2.5 years ago. It's several $billion. And while we don't have, the gas tax couldn't go up, but what the legislature did do was apply the sales tax to gasoline sales. What it did do is start to tax your Amazon delivery and taxed a heck of a lot additional on transportation while leaving the gas tax where it was. There are ways the legislature can get around Tabor, sometimes fortunately, but usually unfortunately. And today, and this is a fact, Tabor protected revenues make up 17 cents of every dollar the state brings in. So most of the state of Colorado's revenues are outside of Tabor because of tuition, because of, the hospital fee and the other variances that made that. So Tabor really doesn't protect the taxpayer on much anymore except the income tax and a few other significant taxes.
A few lightning round questions for you. What's a book that you've read lately that you really enjoyed?
Well, there's a novel about Ireland called This Is Happiness. It may be one of the best books I've ever read. It just makes you laugh the whole way through. It's good. But there is this book that I recommend to people in Colorado called The Left Behind. And it's about rural America. It's written by a Princeton professor, so it kind of sounds like a bar joke or something, that a Princeton professor went into rural America and wrote a book about it. It's the best thing I think I've read about why people in rural America feel left out of the conversation like I was describing before. The author's name is Robert Wuthnow, Wuthnow, and I really recommend it for people who think about the struggles of a divided America.
I read a lot of biographies. Just finished William Manchester's biography on Douglas MacArthur. Just started a biography on Gorbachev by William Taubman. Finished in the last year, really good biography on Napoleon by Andrew Roberts. You know, there's just so much. The challenge I face is that friends give me, and I buy more books than I have time to read. And so it's a nice problem to have, but my reading is typically history and biography, and the history is often of the Second World War as well as Soviet-type world, the Soviet history, which fascinates me because it's what you need to avoid. I mean, it was the big challenge facing our generation was, frankly, the defeat of the Soviet Union, which occurred, except now Russia's rising once again. That was a long, fast round, I guess.
Favorite television show or podcast?
I like the New York Times Daily because I can imitate Michael Barbaro. That's a joke. But I do listen to that once in a while. In terms of podcasts, David Axelrod, I thought, had a good podcast called The Axe, and I think you'd probably agree with a lot of stuff that Governor Owens and I agree about, maybe disagree about some things as well. In terms of TV, I really don't watch TV. I don't watch any, like every once in a while somebody will say, this is a really good series, and my wife and I might sit down and watch it, but very seldom.
I'm like Bill in the sense that we were talking on the way over. I don't watch local TV. I couldn't tell you which campaign ads are running because I do watch Major League Baseball. Full disclosure, I was in Los Angeles Sunday and Monday for the Dodgers v. Mets. Big baseball fan, not a Dodgers fan, so I've become a Mets fan. At least, but watch sports, and I will watch series on Netflix or Amazon, but they're hard to find, and if any of you want to come up to me afterwards and give me series suggestions, I'm always looking forward to really good drama, like Breaking Bad. That would be my example of a perfect drama series.
What is one thing, we have a few students who've asked similar questions, but I'm going to just try and emphasize it. What's the one thing you most admire about each other?
You first.
I admire Bill Ritter for what he's done and continues to do. Peace Corps volunteer in Africa, comes here, comes back, and is a district attorney. That's a tough and thankless job. You have so much challenge when you're the person deciding, and plea bargaining has a bad connotation, but it often leads to good results because what you can do is well, I'm not going to, Bill can talk about that, but deciding life or death decisions on behalf of the people of Colorado as a DA, and then getting into the race for governor where nobody gave him hardly any chance. And he was an outstanding governor for his 4 years, continues to give back, even though it's occasionally where I would debate him on some of his climate. But I admire him for continuing to fight for what he believes in.
Thanks. I appreciate that. So I was kind of a student of government when I became the DA. I didn't expect to be in politics. The governor appointed me, Governor Romer appointed me, and in the first couple of years I met Senator Bill Owens before he was the treasurer of the state, and he was a state senator who absolutely worked across the aisle, absolutely, so the things that he's talked about tonight, they're not made up. And, oftentimes when he's talking about Democrats, he always couched it in my friends on the other side, and he wasn't being phony about that. He really meant that. These were people who were his friends on the other side that he could get along with and still, lead, a state Senate district. Then he was treasurer, and then he was governor. And I followed, his example in trying to understand, okay, in order to govern in a place like this, you really do have to say, my friends on the other side, and mean it, and be genuinely sincere about treating people well, even people you disagreed with. And he did that in campaigns. He did it in the way he governed. He did it, in public events where he was, with other people that were on the other side of the aisle. So I think, like I said, it's not all candy and flowers to be in politics, but there is a civility you can bring to it that can change the conversation and actually, I think, change the culture. And Colorado benefited from his leadership in such an important way because that was his attitude going into it.
Your best day as governor.
There were a lot of good days. Getting to fly in the F-16. Colorado has an air wing of F-16s in the National Guard, and as governor, you're the commander-in-chief of the Guard, and the Guard now the F-16 is a single-seat fighter, but there are two-seat F-16s that they use for training, and they'd bring one in from a different state that would be coming in to Buckley, and and I'm sure you got.
I did.
And how'd you do?
I did fine. I didn't get sick. In fact, they did a touch and go to let all the troops on the ground know that I was okay. Because he said, if we land, they're going to think you might be sick. We went over the Sangre de Cristos upside down.
We did too, Governor Ritter.
They turned the plane upside down, and you go down the other side of the Sangre de Cristos.
You're at 50 feet, even though they say it's 200.
Yeah.
You do, and I remember one time it was Mike Edwards was flying me, and he may have been flying you.
No, because he was the
adjutant
and they lose their ability to fly.
We probably took off the same way. We're going down the runway at Buckley, and he asked for permission for what I think he called a hot box takeoff.
No, it's a sandbox.
Sandbox takeoff?
It's a sandbox.
And he's having to talk to DIA to get permission to go through DIA airspace. And I said, and Mike Edwards is a good friend of mine. I met him when he was a captain, a major. By now he's a colonel. I said, Colonel, what's a sandbox takeoff? And he said, you're about to find out, Governor. And it is straight up from the end of the runway. The runway is right here. You go up a mile. And then he took his hands off the stick. And he said, look, Gov, no hands. And we're upside down. We start coming down. We come all the way back down to the runway, maybe 1,000 feet off it. And then he takes off for the San de Cristo and does the, oh, gosh. When we came in, and I thought it was unique, he did a touch and go coming in, but he didn't tell me. And so we're coming into Buckley, and it's been exhausting. You're at G7, you're hot, you've flown the plane when I did a bad job of flying the plane. But we're coming in, and I'm thinking, okay, I can finally relax and kind of take the mask off, and and then he touches, and then he takes straight off. And it goes just like this. It goes just like this, and you're upside down again. And that was my highlight.
My troopers that were part of my detail, they made me eat these pork burritos, because they wanted to see me throw up, and I didn't throw up. But they fed me these on the way out there. They're like, "We got your breakfast, Governor," and so that kind of thing. It was a lot of fun.
One of our predecessors was ill, but we're not going to discuss who.
Well, I think another U.S. senator too. It's the same thing. It's like, what's your best day? And it's just really hard to describe what your best day is, because you're full of adrenaline really the entire time you're governor. I actually experienced withdrawal when I left office because the adrenaline rush wasn't there, and your body can kind of sense it, but you're kind of on fire all the time about different things, and some things are good, some things are, difficult. Soldiers' deaths who died in the field of war, that was always tough, but there were so many rushes meeting the people of Colorado that it's hard to say this one day was better than the rest.
It does seem like being inverted would have been a pretty good day. Governors, we have a small token of our appreciation that I want to give you on stage here as a thank you for coming to Grand Junction and spending an evening with us. But you can show the crowd what those are. You may now ride for the brand with these Colorado Mesa University
Maverick
Rodeo belt buckles. And
very nice.
Mine says Governor Owens, better governor than Governor Ritter. What does yours say?
Mine just says. So I have this story to tell you real quick, John. I'm walking down the street. We had this nice photo session tonight, but I was walking down the street in Denver, and this guy comes along and goes, "You were governor, weren't you?" And I said, "Yeah." And he goes, "Hey, can we do a selfie?" So he takes a selfie, and as he's walking away, he's calling his wife, and he says, "Honey, I just took a photograph with Bill Owens."
And I have a story from today. Bill and I are at Centennial Airport, and we're going to take the state plane over. It's the same King Air from 20 years ago. And in the state hangar, there are some people who remembered us from the old days, and we're saying hello to them. And this nice lady walks up, and I'm standing there with Bill, and she's a state employee, and she says, "May I take my picture with you, Governor Ritter?" And so Bill says, "Of course," and does. And I'm kind of standing there expecting her to say the same thing to me. She says, "Will you guys have a good day, please?" She walks out.
we could all use a little more good humor and good faith in our lives. You two are modeling it and demonstrating it in spades. Thank you for your service to Colorado, for your leadership, and thank you for coming to Grand Junction tonight.
Thank you. Thank you.